Ambassador Kael'thar stood on the highest tower of the Valari capital city and watched death come from the stars. The sky burned orange and red as massive ships blocked out the twin suns of Nexus Prime. These were not ships built for exploration or trade. These were weapons designed to consume worlds and everything living on them. The insectoid hive swarms had arrived 3 days ago. Their advanced scouts had swept through the outer settlements like a plague of metal and hunger. Now the main fleet hung in the atmosphere like a dark cancer, preparing to feast on everything the Valari had built over 10,000 years of civilization. Kael'thar's pale blue skin rippled with stress patterns that his people had not seen since the ancient wars. His forearms trembled as he held the emergency council reports. The news was worse than anyone had dared imagine. The hive had not come just to conquer. They had come to harvest every living thing on the planet. The communication arrays crackled with desperate messages from the outer cities. Families begged for evacuation ships that would never come. Military commanders reported that their weapons barely scratched the hive vessels. The elegant energy shields that had protected Valari space for centuries meant nothing against these monsters. Behind Kael'thar, the emergency council argued in panicked voices. Defense Minister Yelandra demanded they activate the planet's final weapon systems. Trade Commissioner Neth Ulan insisted they try to negotiate with the hive consciousness. Medical Chief Tel'Orion wanted to begin immediate evacuation of the breeding centers to preserve their species. None of them understood what Kael'thar had learned from studying the reports from the 3 systems the hive had already consumed. There would be no negotiation. There would be no evacuation. There would be no survivors. The hive did not conquer worlds. They ate them completely and moved on to the next meal. The ambassador turned away from the burning sky and walked to the central communication console. His decision would either save his people or doom them to something worse than simple death. The Galactic Federation had made their position clear. No help was coming. The other member species were too afraid of the hive to risk their own worlds. But there was one option that every civilized species in the galaxy feared almost as much as the hive themselves. In the restricted files of the Federation's deepest archives, there were whispered stories about a region of space that had been quarantined for good reason. The Dead Zone, they called it. A place where evolution had gone wrong and created something that should never have been allowed to reach the stars. Kael'thar's primary hands danced over the console controls while his secondary arms pulled up the forbidden star charts. The coordinates were there, buried in files marked with warnings that made even hardened military officers nervous. Deathworld species, the report said, too violent for peaceful contact, too dangerous to be trusted with advanced technology, too unpredictable to be allowed into galactic society. The stories were fragmented and contradictory. Some reports claimed these creatures fought wars that lasted for hundreds of years over resources their own planets provided in abundance. Others said they created weapons specifically designed to cause maximum suffering to their enemies. A few suggested they were so violent that they regularly destroyed their own cities just to rebuild them stronger. What terrified the galactic community most was not their violence, but their unpredictability. Every other known species followed logical patterns. You could predict their responses to threats and opportunities. These Deathworlders seemed to make decisions based on concepts that defied rational analysis. The communication array hummed as Kael'thar activated the long-range transmitters. He began encoding a message using the basic mathematical principles that any spacefaring species should understand: prime numbers, atomic structures, and simple pictographs that showed the location of Nexus Prime and the nature of their emergency. His message was desperate and crude. The translation protocols were primitive because no one had ever tried to communicate with the species in the Dead Zone. But the core meaning was simple enough. We are dying. We need help. Please respond. As the message transmitted across the void toward the forbidden region of space, Kael'thar wondered if he had just made the greatest mistake in Valari history. The hive would kill them all in a matter of days. But if the stories about Deathworlders were true, these mysterious species might do something far worse. The younger council members still believed they could fight or hide or run. They did not understand that the hive had been perfecting the art of planetary consumption for millions of years. Every defense the Valari possessed had been encountered and overcome by the hive countless times before. Kael'thar had studied the aftermath reports from the consumed systems. The hive did not simply kill populations, they harvested everything. The biomass was processed into food for their ships, the minerals were stripped from the planetary crust. Even the atmosphere was collected and stored in massive containment vessels. What made it worse was how efficient they were. A hive fleet could strip a world completely clean in less than a standard week. They left behind dead rocks floating in space, not even suitable for use as mining stations. It was the most thorough form of genocide the galaxy had ever witnessed. The irony was not lost on Kael'thar that in their desperate hour, his people were turning to another species that the galaxy considered a threat to civilized existence. But there was a crucial difference between the hive and the Deathworlders. The hive consumed everything they encountered. The Deathworlders, according to the scattered reports, seemed to consume only each other. The transmission array completed its cycle and fell silent. Somewhere in the darkness between stars, a desperate plea from a dying world was racing toward creatures that might be worse than the monsters already destroying his home. Kael'thar had gambled everything on the hope that these legendary Deathworlders possessed something the hive did not expect to encounter. Outside the tower windows, the hive ships began their descent toward the surface. Massive harvesting vessels, each one larger than the Valari's biggest cities, moved through the atmosphere like falling mountains. Behind them came smaller craft that would sweep through the population centers and begin the systematic collection of every living thing they could find. The planetary defense grid activated in a final gesture of defiance. Elegant energy weapons that had once been the pride of Valari engineering lanced up at the descending ships. The beams struck the hive vessels and scattered harmlessly across their organic armor plating. The hive had encountered energy weapons before. They had adapted. Kael'thar closed his eyes and tried not to think about what would happen to his people in the coming hours. The hive would take the young first, processing them while they were still alive to ensure the freshest biomass. The adults would be kept conscious during harvesting to maintain the quality of their neural tissue. The elders would be last, used for spare organic components when the more valuable populations were exhausted. His communication console chimed softly. For a moment, Kael'thar's heart stopped beating. Then he realized it was just an automated response from the Federation Emergency Services. A polite message explaining that no military assistance was available and recommending immediate surrender to minimize civilian casualties. The ambassador deleted the message without reading the full text. He had heard enough Federation wisdom for one lifetime. Now all he could do was wait and hope that somewhere in the vast darkness of space, someone had heard their cry for help and was capable of providing the kind of assistance that civilized species could not offer. The hive ships landed with sounds like thunder, and the harvesting of Nexus Prime began. Admiral Hyunwoo Kim was reviewing fleet deployment reports when the communication alert sounded across the bridge of the Indomitable. The massive dreadnought was humanity's newest and most powerful warship, bristling with weapons that could crack moons and shields that had never been breached in actual combat. But it was not the ship's firepower that made other species nervous about human military capabilities. It was the fact that humans had built it specifically to fight enemies they had never encountered. The bridge crew snapped to attention as the priority signal came through the long-range communication array. Captain Sojin Park, Hyunwoo's tactical officer, frowned at her console displays as she tried to make sense of the incoming transmission. The signal was weak and badly formatted, using primitive mathematical codes that seemed almost childish compared to standard galactic communication protocols. Commander Donghai Lee leaned over the communication station and ran the message through the translation computers. The basic mathematics were simple enough, but the species that had sent the message clearly had no experience with interstellar communication standards. It took several minutes for the computers to piece together enough, meaning to understand what they were dealing with. Hyunwoo studied the translated message with growing anger. An unknown alien species was begging for help against something called the hive swarms. The aliens were obviously desperate because they had sent their plea into what they called the dead zone. They were asking for military assistance from creatures they had never met and clearly feared almost as much as their attackers. The tactical display showed the location of the alien homeworld, nearly 200 light-years from human space. Sojin quickly calculated jump routes and travel times while Donghai pulled up intelligence files on the region. Neither of them had ever heard of the Valari or the hive swarms, but the message made it clear that an entire civilization was about to be wiped out. What made Hyunwoo's blood boil was the obvious fact that these aliens had tried every other option before turning to humanity for help. The message contained fragments of communication logs showing requests for assistance that had been denied by something called the Galactic Federation. The aliens were dying, while bureaucrats debated the political implications of military intervention. The admiral called an emergency meeting of his senior staff. Within minutes, the war room was filled with the most experienced military minds in human space. Captain Min Ho Choi commanded the dreadnought Soul's Fury, the second largest ship in the fleet. Captain Yuna Shin led the stealth destroyer squadron from her flagship Busan Ghost. Major Woo Jin Kim represented the Marine Assault Divisions that would handle any ground operations. The holographic display showed everything they knew about the situation, which was not much. The Valari homeworld was under attack by an enemy that seemed to specialize in completely destroying other civilizations. The mathematical descriptions in the alien message suggested that the hive used organic ships and overwhelming numbers to consume entire planets. Colonel Junseo Park raised the obvious concern about jumping into an unknown situation without proper intelligence. The humans had no idea what kind of weapons the hive used or how dangerous they might be to human forces. Captain Bo Rahan pointed out that they were dealing with aliens who considered humanity too violent to be trusted, which suggested that standard diplomatic approaches were not going to work. Engineer Hye Jin Yu brought up the logistical problems. The human fleet was designed for defensive operations in human space, not for extended campaigns in unknown regions. They would be operating without supply lines or backup support, facing enemies they knew nothing about, while trying to protect aliens who might not want human help once they understood what it would cost. Lieutenant Tae Yang Jang, the fleet's xenobiologist, was more concerned about the political implications. If humans intervened in what appeared to be a galactic conflict, they would be announcing their presence to every species in this region of space. The consequences could range from trade opportunities to interstellar war, depending on how other aliens reacted to human military capabilities. Hyunwoo listened to all the arguments and objections before making his decision. The discussion was important because it helped clarify the risks and challenges they would face. But the core issue was simple enough that any human child could understand it. Someone was asking for help, and humans did not ignore cries for assistance. They say Admiral activated the fleet-wide communication system and began issuing orders. Every available warship would prepare for immediate departure. The Logistics Corps would load emergency supplies for extended operations. The Intelligence Division would begin analyzing the alien message for any additional tactical information they could extract. Captain Sojin quickly calculated that they could assemble 847 combat vessels within 6 hours. The main battle fleet would be built around the 5 dreadnoughts that could punch through almost any defensive system. The carrier groups would provide fighter support and reconnaissance capabilities. The destroyer squadrons would handle escort duties and anti-shipping operations. Commander Donghai began organizing the support elements that would keep the fleet operational during extended combat. Medical ships would handle casualties. Repair vessels would keep the warships functional. Supply ships would carry everything from ammunition to spare parts to the rations that human crews would need during what might become a very long campaign. The preparations moved with the efficiency that made human military operations famous throughout their own space. Within 2 hours, the orbital shipyards were loading the final supplies and conducting last-minute system checks. Within 4 hours, the crew transfers were complete, and every ship was reporting ready for departure. Major Woo Jin Kim spent the preparation time studying what little information they had about the alien homeworld. His Marine battalions would need to be ready for anything from orbital assault to urban warfare to evacuation operations. The fact that they knew nothing about Valari biology or culture made planning difficult, but Marines were trained to adapt to unexpected situations. Lieutenant Sang-ho Kim and his technology specialists worked on modifying human communication systems to interface with the primitive protocols the aliens were using. If they were going to coordinate with Valari forces, they would need better communication links than mathematical codes transmitted through space. Captain Yoon Ah-shin reviewed stealth operations procedures with her destroyer crews. The Busan Ghost and her sister ships would scout ahead of the main fleet and gather intelligence on the enemy forces. Human stealth technology was designed to hide ships from sensors that were far more advanced than anything the aliens seemed to possess, which should give them a significant advantage in reconnaissance. As the final preparations were completed, Hyun-woo stood on the bridge of the Indomitable and looked out at the largest human war fleet ever assembled. Nearly 1,000 ships filled the space around the shipyards, from massive dreadnoughts that could level continents to nimble fighters that could dance between asteroids. Each ship carried crews that had trained their entire lives for this moment. The irony was not lost on the Admiral that humanity's first contact with alien civilization would be conducted at the point of a gun. They had always imagined that meeting other intelligent species would involve careful diplomacy and cultural exchange. Instead, they were about to announce their presence to the galaxy by destroying everything that threatened their new alien friends. Sojin completed the final navigation calculations and reported that the fleet was ready for departure. The jump to Valari space would take 18 hours using the fastest routes through hyperspace. If the alien message was accurate, they would arrive just in time to witness either the final battle for an alien homeworld or the beginning of humanity's first interstellar war. Hyun-woo gave the order to jump, and 847 human warships vanished into hyperspace. Behind them, Earth's orbital defense stations powered up to maximum alert status. If this rescue mission went badly, humanity might need those defenses sooner than anyone expected. The fleet raced through the darkness between stars toward a world they had never seen, to save people they had never met, from enemies they knew nothing about. It was exactly the kind of impossible situation that humans seemed to specialize in making work through sheer stubborn determination and overwhelming firepower. In 18 hours, the galaxy would learn what happened when someone asked humanity for help. The human fleet dropped out of hyperspace at the edge of the SciFiPrime system and immediately went to maximum combat alert. What appeared on their sensors made even veteran officers stop breathing for a moment. The hive swarms were not just attacking the alien homeworld. They were systematically disassembling it piece by piece, while the population was still alive to witness their own extinction. Admiral Hyun-woo Kim stood on the bridge of the Indomitable and watched the tactical display update with information that made his stomach turn. Massive organic ships, each one larger than human cities, hung in the atmosphere of the alien world, like parasites feeding on a dying host. Smaller vessels moved between the surface and the larger ships, carrying cargo that the sensors identified as processed biological matter. Captain Sojin Park ran the sensor data through the computer analysis systems and reported findings that confirmed their worst fears. The Hive was not conducting a military conquest. They were harvesting every living thing on the planet and converting it into resources for their fleet. The mathematical precision of the operation suggested they had done this many times before. Commander Dong-Hai Lee established communication links with the surviving alien transmitters on the planet's surface. The signals were weak and filled with static, but the universal translation protocols managed to piece together enough meaning to understand what was happening. The Valari were dying by the millions while their government tried to coordinate evacuation efforts that had no chance of success. Lieutenant Tae-Yang Jang, the fleet xenobiologist, managed to establish direct contact with someone who identified himself as Ambassador Kael'thar. The alien's voice came through the communicators filled with exhaustion and despair, but also with amazement that anyone had actually responded to their desperate call for help. Through broken translations and mathematical diagrams, Kael'thar explained the situation on SciFiPrime. The Hive had been consuming star systems for millions of years, leaving behind dead worlds that could not support any form of life. The Galactic Federation had declared the Hive unstoppable and advised all member species to evacuate any systems in their path. What made Hyun-woo's anger burn even hotter was learning that the Federation had the military strength to stop the Hive if they worked together. But they were too afraid of casualties to risk their own forces in battle. Instead, they preferred to sacrifice entire civilizations rather than fight an enemy that might actually hurt them. The Valari had tried everything their civilization could imagine. They had offered tribute, attempted negotiation, and finally begged for asylum in Federation space. Every request had been denied. The galactic community was willing to mourn the Valari extinction, but not willing to prevent it. Captain Min Ho Choi reported from the Soul's Fury that his sensors were detecting over 3,000 hive vessels in the system. The enemy ships were organic constructs that seemed to grow rather than being built in traditional shipyards. Their hulls were living tissue that could repair itself and adapt to different types of attacks. Captain Yuna Shin's stealth destroyers moved closer to the planet and sent back detailed reconnaissance data. The Hive ground forces were not soldiers in any recognizable sense. They were specialized organisms designed for specific tasks like biomass collection, infrastructure demolition, and population herding. Each creature was perfectly suited for its role in the harvesting process. The reports from the surface were almost too horrible to believe. The Hive was keeping large portions of the Valari population alive during the harvesting process to maintain the quality of the biological materials. They were collecting. Families were being separated and processed according to age and health status to maximize the efficiency of the operation. Major Woo Jin Kim's Marines prepared for immediate planetary assault while studying the tactical data. The Hive ground forces appeared to have no concept of traditional military tactics. They simply overwhelmed defenders through sheer numbers and biological adaptation. But they had never encountered enemies who fought back with the systematic fury that humans brought to warfare. Hyun-woo made his decision quickly. The human fleet would engage the Hive immediately and continue fighting until either the aliens were safe or the human fleet was destroyed. There would be no negotiation, no tactical withdrawal, and no acceptable casualties among the civilian population they had come to protect. The Admiral opened a communication channel to Ambassador Kael'thar and delivered a message that would become famous throughout human space. He told the alien leader that help had arrived and that the Hive would be destroyed. When Kael'thar asked what humans wanted in return for their assistance, Hyun-woo's response was simple. Nothing except friendship and the knowledge that innocent people would live to see another day. The human fleet formed into battle formations that had been tested in countless simulations but never used against alien enemies. The dreadnoughts would punch through the Hive fleet to create corridors for the smaller ships. The carriers would launch fighter waves to disrupt Hive coordination. The destroyers would hunt down any enemy vessels that tried to escape. Captain Bo-Ra Han led the first wave of bombers toward the largest Hive ships. Her pilots had trained for years to attack targets that could fight back with advanced technology. The Hive vessels were large and slow, relying on their organic armor to absorb damage rather than avoiding it. Human weapons were designed to overwhelm, exactly that type of defense. Engineer Hye-jin Yu worked with her teams to modify human weapons systems for maximum effectiveness against organic targets. Traditional armor-piercing rounds were replaced with incendiary shells that would burn through living tissue. Energy weapons were recalibrated to disrupt biological functions rather than just causing structural damage. The first engagement began when the human fleet opened fire at maximum range. Thousands of missiles streaked across space toward the Hive vessels, followed by energy beams that could boil oceans. The Hive ships responded by launching clouds of smaller organisms that tried to intercept the incoming weapons. What happened next shocked both the Valari observers and the Hive consciousness. Human weapons were not designed for surgical precision against specific targets. They were designed to destroy everything in their path as completely as possible. The interceptor organisms were vaporized instantly, and the main weapons continued toward their targets without any reduction in effectiveness. The larger Hive ships tried to adapt their organic armor to absorb the human attacks. The living tissue began changing color and density as it attempted to counter the incoming energy. But human weapons engineers had spent centuries developing ways to defeat adaptive defenses. Each weapon system used different principles specifically to prevent enemies from adapting to them. Lieutenant Sang-ho Kim coordinated electronic warfare attacks that confused the Hive's biological communication systems. The organic ships relied on chemical and bioelectric signals to coordinate their actions. Human jamming technology created false signals that caused Hive vessels to attack each other or move into positions where human weapons could destroy them more easily. The battle became a demonstration of why other galactic species feared human military capabilities. Humans did not just fight to win. They fought to completely destroy their enemies and everything those enemies represented. Every human crew member understood that failure meant watching innocent aliens die horribly while their killers escaped. To repeat the process elsewhere, Commander Donghae Lee maintained constant communication with the Valari survivors on the planet's surface. As human forces pushed deeper into the Hive fleet, evacuation corridors opened up that allowed some of the alien population to reach safety. But Hyunwoo made it clear that evacuation was not the primary mission. The primary mission was extermination. The whole Hive consciousness began to realize that it was facing something unprecedented. These new enemies did not fight for territory or resources. They fought with an emotional intensity that made no logical sense. Every human loss only seemed to make the survivors fight harder and with less regard for their own safety. As the first day of battle ended, the human fleet had destroyed over 400 Hive vessels and pushed the enemy forces back from the most populated areas of Nexus Prime. But the cost had been severe. Nearly 100 human ships were destroyed or too damaged to continue fighting. Thousands of human crew members had died to save aliens they had never met. The galaxy was about to learn what happened when humanity decided that something was worth dying for. The second day of the battle for Nexus Prime revealed the true nature of human warfare to both the Valari and the Hive consciousness. While other galactic species fought with calculated precision and careful resource management, humans fought with an emotional intensity that transformed every engagement into a personal vendetta against anything that threatened innocent life. Captain Bo-Ra Han's bomber squadrons had lost half their aircraft during the first day's fighting, but the surviving pilots flew with a fury that made Hive organic defenses useless. When conventional weapons failed to penetrate the adaptive armor of the largest Hive ships, Bo-Ra ordered her pilots to use ramming attacks that turned their bombers into guided missiles loaded with nuclear warheads. The Valari watched in amazement as human pilots deliberately crashed their ships into enemy vessels, knowing they would die in the explosion but ensuring that critical Hive infrastructure was destroyed. These were not desperate last-resort tactics. They were calculated decisions made by crews who had weighed their own lives against the lives of the aliens they had come to protect. Colonel Jun Seo Park's ground forces demonstrated the same terrifying dedication when they landed on Nexus, primed to rescue Valari civilians trapped in Hive harvesting centers. The human Marines fought with weapons and tactics that were designed for maximum lethality rather than efficient resource use. They carried enough firepower to level small cities and used it without hesitation whenever Hive forces threatened their mission. The Hive ground organisms had evolved to handle resistance from civilized species that followed logical military doctrines. They could adapt to energy weapons, projectile weapons, and even chemical weapons given enough time and casualties. But they had never encountered enemies who used warfare as an expression of moral outrage rather than a tool for achieving political objectives. Engineer Hye Jin-yu worked around the clock to modify mining equipment and construction tools into improvised weapons that could destroy Hive organisms more effectively than military hardware. Her teams turned industrial welders into flame weapons that could burn through organic armor. They converted construction explosives into bombs that could collapse entire Hive breeding complexes. What shocked the Valari most was not just the effectiveness of human weapons, but the fact that humans seemed to consider the protection of alien civilians more important than their own survival. Human soldiers would charge into obviously suicidal situations if it meant saving a few more Valari lives. Human pilots would use their own ships as shields to protect alien evacuation vessels. Lieutenant Taiyang Jiang established field hospitals where human medics worked to save both human and Valari casualties. The medical teams had no training in alien biology, but they improvised treatment methods that kept wounded Valari alive long enough for their own doctors to provide proper care. The humans refused to prioritize their own injured over alien civilians. The Hive consciousness struggled to understand the tactical situation. These new enemies seemed to ignore basic principles of self-preservation and resource conservation. They would sacrifice expensive equipment and highly trained personnel to achieve objectives that provided no obvious strategic advantage. Their behavior made no sense according to any military doctrine the Hive had encountered. Captain Min-Ho Choi's dreadnought Soul's Fury became the focal point of the space battle when the largest Hive vessels concentrated their attacks on the human flagship. The organic ships fired biological weapons that could dissolve metal and convert living tissue into raw materials for their own use. But human ship armor was designed to resist exactly those types of attacks. The Soul's Fury returned fire with weapons that could crack planets. Her main guns fired projectiles that massed several tons each and traveled at significant fractions of light speed. When they struck Hive vessels, the kinetic energy release was equivalent to nuclear explosions. The organic armor that had protected Hive ships for millions of years simply vaporized on contact. Captain Yuna Shin's stealth destroyers hunted Hive command vessels with the patience of predators that had evolved on a world where everything was trying to kill everything else. The human ships used sensor technology that could track individual life forms through solid rock. When they found Hive leaders, they destroyed them with precision strikes that left the surrounding organic fleet confused and uncoordinated. Major Woo Jin Kim's Marines established defensive perimeters around Valari population centers and held them against overwhelming numbers of Hive ground forces. The humans built fortifications using local materials and improvised weapons that could destroy attackers faster than the Hive could adapt to them. They fought for 72 hours without rest, fueled by stimulants and sheer determination. The human soldiers used close-quarters combat techniques that horrified even the mindless Hive warriors. They carried weapons designed for hand-to-hand, fighting against enemies that were stronger, faster, and more durable than human beings. When their ammunition ran out, they used knives, clubs, and their bare hands to continue fighting. Lieutenant Sang-Ho Kim and his technology specialists discovered that Hive communication systems could be disrupted by broadcasting specific electromagnetic frequencies. They turned every human communication array into a jamming system that flooded Hive bioelectric networks with noise. The organic ships began attacking each other as their coordination systems failed. Engineer Hae Jin-Yu's teams captured intact Hive technology and reverse-engineered it in real time during the battle. They learned how organic ship systems worked and developed countermeasures that turned the Hive's own biological advantages against them. Human adaptability proved faster than Hive evolution when driven by the urgency of protecting innocent lives. The turning point came when the humans realized that the Hive consciousness was not actually a single intelligence controlling millions of organisms. It was a network of biological computers that could be disrupted if enough of the central nodes were destroyed simultaneously. Captain Bo Ra-han led a coordinated strike that eliminated 12 command clusters in less than 10 minutes. Without centralized coordination, the individual Hive organisms reverted to simple programmed behaviors that made them easy targets for human weapons. The massive ships that had seemed unstoppable began drifting aimlessly as their biological control systems failed. The ground forces stopped adapting to human tactics and became predictable enough for the Marines to eliminate systematically. Commander Dong-Hai Lee coordinated the final phase of the battle, directing human forces to eliminate every remaining Hive presence in the star system. There would be no negotiated settlement, no prisoners, and no survivors to carry word of human capabilities to other Hive fleets. The extermination would be complete and absolute. The Valari survivors watched as human ships hunted down the last, fleeing Hive vessels with methodical precision. These were not warriors celebrating victory. They were exterminators completing a necessary task. Every human crew member understood that allowing even one Hive ship to escape meant condemning other innocent species to the same fate that had almost befallen the Valari. As the third day of battle ended, the SciFiPrime system was cleared of all Hive presence. Over 2,000 enemy vessels had been completely destroyed. The organic matter that had once been a terrifying invasion fleet was now drifting debris scattered across several million cubic kilometers of space. The cost to humanity had been severe. Nearly 300 human ships were destroyed or too damaged to return home. Over 50,000 human military personnel had died in 3 days of continuous combat. But their sacrifice had saved an entire alien civilization and sent a message that would resonate throughout the galaxy. The Deathworlders had answered the call for help, and they had proven that some things were worth dying for. The silence that followed the destruction of the last Hive vessel was unlike anything Ambassador Kael'thar had ever experienced. For 3 days, the skies of SciFiPrime had burned with constant warfare as human ships battled the creatures that had seemed unstoppable. Now the alien fleet that had come to rescue his people floated among the debris of their enemies, and the universe felt fundamentally different. Admiral Hyunwoo Kim stood on the bridge of the damaged but victorious Indomitable and surveyed the aftermath of humanity's first interstellar war. The cost had been enormous by any measure. Nearly 300 human vessels were destroyed, and over 50,000 of his people had died fighting for aliens they had never met. But the alternative had been watching an entire civilization disappear while doing nothing to prevent it. The human fleet formed defensive formations around Nexus Prime, while rescue operations continued across the planet's surface. Major Woo Jin, Kim's Marines worked alongside Valari emergency services to locate survivors and provide medical assistance. The humans had brought their own medical supplies and equipment, but they freely shared everything with the alien population that needed help. Captain Sojin Park coordinated with Valari authorities to establish communication networks that would allow better coordination of relief efforts. The primitive translation systems that had made first contact possible were gradually replaced with more sophisticated protocols that allowed meaningful conversation between the two species. What amazed the Valari was not just that the humans had won an impossible battle, but that they asked for nothing in return. Admiral Hyunwoo refused all offers of tribute, territorial concessions, or trade advantages. When Ambassador Kale Thar asked what humanity wanted as payment for their assistance, the human leader's response became legendary throughout Valari culture. Hyunwoo explained that humans did not charge fees for preventing genocide. They had come because someone needed help, and they had fought because innocent people were dying. The only payment they wanted was friendship and mutual defense agreements that would prevent this kind of tragedy from happening again to anyone. The implications of human military capabilities sent shockwaves throughout the galactic community. Within days of the battle's end, delegations from dozens of species were requesting permission to visit Nexus Prime and meet these mysterious Deathworlders who had accomplished what the entire Galactic Federation had declared impossible. Captain Minho Choi found himself hosting diplomatic meetings aboard the Soul's Fury as alien representatives tried to understand how human military technology worked. The visitors were particularly confused by the fact that human weapons seemed designed to be as destructive as possible rather than as efficient as possible. The cultural differences became apparent immediately. Other galactic species built weapons to achieve specific military objectives with minimal resource expenditure. Humans built weapons to completely destroy anything that threatened innocent people, regardless of the cost. The philosophical gap was almost impossible for alien minds to bridge. Commander Donghai Lee established the first human embassy on a non-human world, working with Valari officials to create diplomatic protocols that had never been needed before. The process was complicated by the fact that human diplomatic traditions assumed that other parties would sometimes act irrationally or dishonestly, while Valari culture was based on logical cooperation. The Galactic Federation faced an unprecedented crisis as news of the human intervention spread throughout their territory. Member species began questioning why their combined fleets had been unable to stop an enemy that a single human battle group had eliminated in 3 days. The political implications threatened to destabilize the entire galactic government structure. Lieutenant Taeyang Jiang became humanity's first xenobiologist to study multiple alien species as representatives from across the galaxy arrived to establish contact. Each species had evolved different solutions to the challenges of intelligence and technology, but none had developed the peculiar combination of compassion and lethality that characterized human civilization. The arrival of Galactic Federation. Officials created diplomatic tensions that nearly resulted in renewed warfare. The Federation demanded that humans submit to galactic law and accept Federation authority over their military forces. Admiral Hyunwoo's response was diplomatically worded but absolutely clear. Humanity would cooperate with other species, but they would not accept restrictions on their ability to help victims of aggression. Captain Yuna Shin's stealth destroyers discovered that the Hive invasion of Nexus Prime had been only one component of a larger campaign. Intelligence gathered from captured Hive organic computers revealed that 3 other star systems were under attack by similar fleets. The Federation had written off all 4 systems as acceptable losses. The human response was immediate and uncompromising. Admiral Hyunwoo divided his remaining forces and dispatched rescue fleets to all 3 threatened systems. The fact that Humanity was willing to weaken their own defenses to protect alien species they had never heard of, sent a clear message about human priorities. Engineer Hyejin Yu worked with Valari scientists to develop new technologies that combined human engineering principles with alien materials science. The collaboration produced innovations that neither species could have achieved alone. More importantly, it established the foundation for genuine cooperation between radically different civilizations. The rescue of the other 3 star systems took 6 months and cost humanity another 200 ships and 30,000 lives. But the campaign established human military credibility throughout the galaxy and demonstrated that the Deathworlders were not just capable of violence, but willing to use it consistently to protect innocent species. Ambassador Kael'thar became humanity's strongest advocate in galactic politics, arguing that these dangerous Deathworlders represented hope rather than threat. His people had witnessed human warriors dying to protect alien children, and that experience had changed Valari understanding of what civilization could mean. The political transformation of the galaxy accelerated when an ancient enemy returned to threaten all intelligent life. The mechanical plague had been dormant for millions of years, but something had awakened the automated weapons systems that had once tried to sterilize the galaxy of organic life. The Federation's traditional approach of negotiation and compromise was useless against enemies that did not recognize the concept of surrender. When the first mechanical plague fleets appeared in Federation space, it was humanity that other species turned to for salvation. The same military capabilities that had made the galaxy nervous about human intentions became the foundation of galactic defense against an enemy that wanted to kill everything that lived. Captain Bo-Ra Han led the development of anti-plague tactics that used human understanding of systematic warfare to counter the mechanical precision of automated enemies. The key insight was that humans had spent their entire history fighting enemies that could adapt and learn. They were uniquely qualified to defeat enemies that followed programmed patterns. Lieutenant Sang-Ho Kim's electronic warfare specialists discovered that mechanical plague systems could be confused by the same kinds of chaotic signals that human military communication used to prevent interception. The random patterns that made human operations seem unpredictable to other species were incomprehensible to artificial intelligences that expected logical behavior. The war against the mechanical plague lasted for 3 years and established humanity as the unofficial protectors of galactic civilization. Human fleets became the first response to any existential threat, while human diplomatic principles influenced the development of new interspecies cooperation agreements. Admiral Hyunwoo Kim eventually retired to become humanity's first galactic ambassador, representing not just human interests, but the principle that advanced civilizations had moral obligations to protect those who could not protect themselves. His final speech to the reformed Galactic Council became required reading in human military academies. The distress call that had brought humanity to the stars had transformed the galaxy in ways that no one could have predicted. The Deathworlders, who were once feared as too violent for civilized contact, had become the guardians of everything that made civilization worth preserving. Humanity had found their place among the stars not as conquerors or traitors, but as the species that answered distress calls regardless of the cost. It was exactly the kind of impossible responsibility that humans seemed born to carry.